Thank you very much for joining today's Market Insights webinar presented by the Energy and Resources Law Association. We're presenting today on the topic that we're calling the Nickel Pickle. The main subject for our session is this. There's a transition to electric vehicles, which is a significant part of decarbonisation plans in many parts of the world. And demand and sales of EV vehicles is booming, and it's only going to grow massively in the next years. The tricky reality is that EVs need batteries that utilize a substantial and growing volume of refined nickel. However, the process of mining and refining that nickel for EV battery production is itself affected by a number of important ESG issues, including a large carbon footprint. So there's a dilemma between the goal of electric vehicles and the materials that go into them. And Indonesia's a big part of the story, as we'll learn more from the session today. So my name is Andrew Diggs, and I'm a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. And I'm very pleased to be able to host this session with two experts in the nickel supply chain, Stephen Brown and Lyle Trytten, who are going to help us find out more about the ESG issues affecting the nickel supply chain. I'll just mention that we've had about 100 people register to join today, and so we're not going to be opening up to audio and video for attendees, unfortunately, because we'd love to have a discussion with everyone. But we do encourage you to give your input through the chat function, where you can leave a question if you like. And if you'd like to, you can say who you are and where you're from when you send a question. If time allows, at the end of our session, we hope we'll be able to get to some of the questions. And if we don't get to questions, we can always follow up afterwards. If you'd like to get in touch with Stephen or Lyle or me as well, we are planning to send around some contact details after the session to everyone who registered. So for now, I would like to introduce Lyle Trytten. So Lyle has been working in the nickel industry for more than 25 years, and his experience is in project development, operations and sustainability, and advising on laterite and sulfide ore projects all around the world. Lyle, would you like to give a bit more of your background, please?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I've spent my career primarily in the nickel industry, dealing with a few other base metals as well. Worked in Australia at the Murrin facility for a year. I've been in a number of the other laterite and sulfide facilities around the world, but most of my experience comes from the Sherritt organization, who developed many of the nickel processes that are used globally today, including the high pressure acid leaching used in Murrin and other facilities, the ammonia leaching used at BHP's Kwinana refinery, as well as here in Alberta, and the processes used in South Africa for the platinum group metals. I've done all of the whole life cycle of projects and finished my career at Sherritt working in sustainability and environment. So ESG is pretty core to how I think about getting resources to market.
All right, thanks very much. And introducing Stephen Brown. So Steve is an independent consultant focusing on the responsible supply of battery metals. He was previously working in Indonesia as Vale's General Manager of Business Development. Steve, why don't you give a bit more information about why you know so much about Indonesia and nickel?
Yeah, so I was currently based in Australia, but previously I spent almost 20 years in Indonesia with Vale as the General Manager of Business Development there. And so I had a great opportunity to work not just within Vale, but also I had a lot of interaction with the other nickel operators in Indonesia. And we together sort of negotiated with the government on a range of issues. So I got to have a good feel for all of the Indonesian operations and also with the Indonesian government as well. So hopefully I can contribute to the discussion today.
Thanks, I'm absolutely sure you will. So so as we kick off the session, and before we dive into the nitty gritty of the ESG issues that the nickel supply chain faces, I thought it would be good if we take a few minutes to set the scene and really explain why this topic is so important. And so I might ask Lyle, if you can give a bit of an explanation about what's driving the demand for nickel around the world, and then perhaps Steve will give some information about where that nickel's being supplied from. Thanks, Lyle.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, 25 years in the nickel business, you see some peaks and troughs in the commodity businesses. And right now, the world is primed for growth in nickel demand that's unlike anything we've seen before. And it's all really deriving from the global fight against climate change. Historically, nickel is used primarily for stainless steel. That's 2/3 of the demand. And it's a slow growing market, always growing, but just not super fast. Today, that whole paradigm is changing. Transport contributes about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The largest two segments of that are passenger vehicles and road freight. So the plans that countries are putting together for decarbonization and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions rely heavily on switching to electric vehicles. All these credible national plans include switching their fleets to EVs over the next 20 years or so. These not only have greenhouse gas benefits, but they've also got significant other benefits, such as reduced health impacts from air pollution. And so in a lot of crowded cities in Europe, you've already seen reductions in allowing diesel vehicles into city cores because of the air pollution issues. EVs will help improve that dramatically. That growth in electric vehicles is projected to be huge. There's about 10 million vehicles on the road today. We're expecting about 200 million by 2030 and continuing to grow from there. So the annual sales are expected to be increasing after 2030 from 40 million a year to about 70 million vehicles a year, all of which will use lithium-ion batteries. There are a number of battery chemistries. They don't all use nickel, but the highest energy density and the longest range batteries are high nickel batteries. So these are your premium batteries. I finished an analysis recently here in North America, which suggested a fleet average here around 40 kilograms of nickel per vehicle. That's just passenger vehicles, doesn't include road freight. It should be a little bit less in Asia and Europe because the distances are generally a little bit less, but that means millions of tons of nickel going into EVs globally by 2030 and continuing to grow from there. So that's the primary driver of a big demand increase for nickel in the coming years. But it's not only that. Nickel is also used in a range of energy generation technologies that we're going to be using. Geothermal energy takes about 100 tons of nickel per megawatt of energy produced. Nuclear, wind, carbon capture and sequestration all use stainless steel, which drives nickel demand. So the expected demand growth really depends on the pace of decarbonization. You know, are we going to do this quickly? Are we going to do this slowly? You know, that's a bit of a mug's game to guess that. But the recent analysis from the International Energy Agency suggests that growth could be as low as 1.2 million tons per year of additional nickel by 2040, up to maybe 4 million tons per year of additional nickel by 2040. That's on a market that today is about 2.4 million tons a year. That's pretty significant growth. And that has to, we also have to account normal production declines. Ore bodies decline and then close. Smelters sometimes close because they're old and tired. So it's accounting for decline and new growth is what we have to really look at. Most of this is going to be needed as pure nickel products, which today make up less than half of the world production. So we might have around 1 million tons today of pure nickel products, and we're going to need to add another 1 to 4 million tons of pure nickel products to that. That's not the alloy products that Indonesia largely produces now, but it is where they're going with some of the new chemical nickel products that they're producing in some of the newer facilities. So it's a big ask for us to produce that much more nickel.
All right, well, it sounds like massive growth there, Steve. So where's it all going to come from?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, as Lyle said, we know that there's an exponential growth curve in demand, but where do we get that nickel from? So I guess historically, Russia and Canada have historically been the big producers. But what we saw maybe around the mid-2000s was a bit of a shift with China emerging as a big producer of nickel. Now, of course, China doesn't have a lot of its own nickel resources, so the ore was coming from Indonesia and Philippines predominantly. So that was unprocessed nickel ore at 2% nickel being shipped across to China, sometimes inland, and then smelted in China to produce nickel. And China really became a major producer of nickel since the mid-2000s. But all of that changed in 2014 when Indonesia decided it was not going to export any more unprocessed ore. And so a lot of that investment that was taking place in China then stopped and started to shift across to Indonesia. And since 2014, Indonesia has grown from producing around 100,000 tons of nickel. I think the forecast for this year is something over 800,000 tons of nickel will be produced this year just in Indonesia. And it's really, if you think about where nickel will continue to come from, where that growth in nickel production will come from, Indonesia has certainly proven that it can ramp up very, very quickly. And so I think it's really well placed to do that. And if you look at the economics of projects, Indonesian nickel sort of remains as the best economics you can find compared to other places around the world. There's still a lot of resource elsewhere. The Canada, Russia, Australia, Philippines, New Caledonia. These places have the nickel too, but the economics are just not able to match what Indonesia can produce at this point in time. So it's shaping up to be, at least in the next 5 years, that Indonesia will continue to be the main source of growth in nickel production. There might be some other projects that come online in the 5 to 10 years that add production elsewhere, but there's some question marks on those projects as well because they're so far into the future, whereas the Indonesian ones are right on the doorstep and they're in construction now or in late development stage.
Steve, on that, I'm just thinking, with this massive growth in demand, do we expect that there will also be substantial growth in prices for nickel? And will that increase in pricing, if forecast out into the future, be a driver for development in other locations other than Indonesia, because the market it makes those projects more viable?
Yeah, so it all comes down to how quickly Indonesia grows, because it's kept pace with demand to date. So if you look at the supply and demand, the market is in surplus today, very slight, but Indonesia's growth has been able to keep pace with demand so far, whereas other places have remained flat or declined. But as that growth continues to increase, it just depends on how quickly Indonesia is able to continue adding production lines. And so if Indonesia isn't able to keep up, then that will produce that increase in price of nickel price, which could incentivize other projects elsewhere. But I think Western producers require a sustained increase in price. There's a lot more risk aversion in the West, I would say, and so the investors that are coming to Indonesia are more willing to take that risk, and they've been willing to invest even when prices are down around the 10,000 mark, which is half of what they are today. They're still willing to make those big investments, whereas Western producers just haven't been able to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Andrew, if I could just add to that for a second.
Please.
We're sitting right now in North America. I've got a list of the projects here. It adds up to maybe 200,000 tons a year that could be brought on if people believed that the prices were going to be strong for long. So, even if we brought them all on, it's still going to be a struggle. We need a lot to come from elsewhere. The issue really isn't so much what the price is, it's what people believe the price is going to be for the long run, right? When you're building a nickel mine, you're betting on 20 years or more of operation for a big new nickel mine in North America. They're mostly long life deposits. Some of the Indonesian deposits are shorter life facilities. They're just mining ore, shipping it, and they can open and close fairly quickly. The real potential game changer out there is deep sea mining of ocean nodules in some very deep areas of the ocean. that could potentially bring hundreds of thousands of tons of supply on if they ever get going. But there's so many social questions around our willingness to allow that, that right now, I think is a really big question as to whether it will happen or not.
All right, well, I think we can now maybe, again, before looking at the actual details of the ESG issues, I think it might be helpful if we explore a little bit about why it is that nickel suppliers need to care so much about environmental and social and governance issues. So what is it that's giving them the need to focus more on these issues more than ever before, Steve?
I think mining, in the past, there was a lot of pressure on big mining companies to behave, even overseas. So there's a lot of cases where a major company, like say, for example, BHP, was under pressure for a nickel development in Indonesia that they were planning. They didn't end up developing it, but there was a lot of pressure on that. But a lot of the smaller companies were able to sort of escape that sort of pressure in the past, but things have changed now. I think we saw in 2016, Amnesty International released a report on, it was titled "What's in Your Phone?" So it linked child labor in the DRC to the cobalt supply, which was, the cobalt was in pretty much everyone's smartphone, in the battery of the smartphone or their laptops. There was a big social media campaign that went along with that investigative report, and that really pointed out that we're all part of this mining supply chain. We all use minerals from around the world, and people started to become aware that batteries can contribute to ESG issues halfway across the world. And so that put a lot of pressure on companies who were using those batteries to look to their supply chain and clean up their supply chain. So the pressure then started to come through that supply chain from manufacturers like Apple, Sony, everybody that produced a device with a battery in it then needed to assure their customers that they were sourcing their metals sustainably. So this pressure is now coming to nickel. There's a lot of similarities between the DRC's cobalt supply and Indonesian nickel. Indonesian nickel is set to produce maybe half of the world's supply in the next few years. DRC produces around 60% of the world's cobalt. So there's a lot of dependency on, the cobalt world depends on the DRC, just like the nickel world now is starting to depend on Indonesia. And there is a lot of ESG concern in the nickel production all over the world, but especially in Indonesia, I would say, due to a number of reasons. But I think we can get into those a little bit later.
Yeah, let's explore those a bit later. So that sounds like, pressure coming from consumers, corporates, maybe shareholders, but Lyle, what about from a regulatory point of view? Is the law also catching up with or restricting issues around ESG?
Yeah, well, certainly, we saw following the cobalt issue, some additional pressures on legal forms. If we go back before that, there was a bunch of work done in the early 2000s around tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold that ended up being enshrined in the Dodd-Frank Act in the US and in a similar act in the European Union, requiring companies that use these materials to be transparent in their supply chains. And that has now come to cobalt, where people are very concerned about where it's coming from and the human rights associated with that. But it's getting bigger now. And so we have the EU kind of leading the charge and bringing forward two mechanisms to look at this. One is their so-called battery regulation that has been proposed and is going before the European Parliament, where they're looking to do carbon footprinting of batteries, eventually carbon restrictions. So batteries will have to meet a certain threshold of carbon intensity, and also social life cycle assessments to look at the social impacts of mining. How that's going to get done, it's unclear yet, but the pressure is certainly there. And with many of these types of issues, we see Europe as the leading jurisdiction. North America tends to follow, and then other jurisdictions follow behind that. We also see Europe bringing forward carbon border adjustments, where they're looking to penalize products coming into the European Union that have a high carbon footprint so they don't disadvantage their own manufacturers. And at this point, it's really focused on commodity things like, concrete and steel and aluminum, but it could easily get extended to stainless steel, which is a big nickel end use, and other materials. And I think you're going, that conversation is certainly live in North America as well. And it's just like anti-dumping conversations. It's really very much of the same kind of approach, where you put big tariffs on people that don't behave well. And that's potentially going to be very significant for Indonesian nickel and Chinese nickel.
All right, so we see that the suppliers, and many of whom are going to be are in Indonesia and are going to be in Indonesia, need to be alive to these issues and aware of them. Now let's explore, if we can, just exactly what those ESG issues are. So what are the ESG issues that are being caused by nickel production or affect nickel production in Indonesia? And to the extent you can, to the audience, please share any ideas on how we might be able to mitigate any of those issues. Lyle?
Yeah, so the biggest one that's being talked about right now is obviously carbon, right? We don't really want to be having a really big greenhouse gas footprint for the electric vehicles that we're relying on to solve the carbon challenge. It's not the only one, but that's the one that's getting the most airplay right now. And within the industry, there's a wide range of performance metrics, and it comes about because of the geology. Nickel comes in two different types or flavors. That range right now is from almost zero, it's very close to zero for some producers, to over 70 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of nickel produced. The industry average is around 30. The lowest Indonesian producer is the Sorowako plant that Vale built decades ago, because it has hydroelectric dams that supply most of the power. The sulfide ore bodies that we mine in big chunks of Australia, BHP's Nickel West is all sulfide. In Canada, in Russia, Finland, etc., have some inherent advantages. The ore by its very nature can be concentrated at the mine site to make a small quantity of rich material that can be shipped and treated, whereas the laterite ore bodies that are predominant in the tropics and to some degree in Western Australia don't have that. You can't really concentrate them, and so they just take a lot more energy because you have to treat the whole ore body. What we see is that the kinds of processes like they use at the Monero refinery in Western Australia, high pressure acid leaching, it's used in New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, in Cuba, in Madagascar, Philippines, and now starting up in Indonesia. They tend to be in the 15 to 30 tons of greenhouse gases per ton of nickel range. The sulfides typically in the 10 range. The big producers, though, in Indonesia are ferronickel and nickel pig iron facilities, where there's smelters that melt the entire ore body with power usually derived from coal-fired power plants. And then they add coal or coke or some other form of carbon to these in order to do the chemistry needed in the smelter. And those give them very high carbon intensities, typically 40, 50, 60 tons per ton of nickel. And so that nickel is not favored for heading into the battery supply chain. But it all goes into stainless steel now anyway. It isn't going into the battery supply chain yet, but it might have to. If all our growth is going to come out of Indonesia, we're going to be forced to convert that at an even higher carbon cost to go into the battery chain, and that's going to be a problem. So what do we do about this? Well, renewable energy will take us a long ways, but solar and wind aren't the answers. Smelters, they're melting the ore body. They need 24/7 power. So really it's got to be hydro or maybe geothermal. You could do a lot of geothermal in Indonesia. Hydro is going to have significant ESG impacts of its own. When you start flooding valleys in biodiverse areas, there's going to be some issues that we'll talk about. You can bring in LNG and run power plants based on that, but it's a pretty expensive power source. And Indonesian nickel is very cost effective now because they have cheap power from locally sourced coal. The coal that we add for the chemistry component in the smelters, that theoretically could be switched to hydrogen. We're already seeing that being done for steel production, which is very similar. Nobody's trying it today that I know of, but theoretically it works. Might require some rebuilds of the smelters in order to make that work. But it's entirely possible. And what we've seen is the willingness to move fast with the construction and modification of these smelters in Indonesia. So that might happen there. But I think you're not going to see a big change in the carbon footprint until big hydro projects are built.
The carbon footprint is the one that everybody's talking about because it's directly linked to climate change, and climate change, of course, is the driver for these EVs. But I really think the biggest issue in the laterite nickel area is the biodiversity. So as Lyle mentioned, there's the sulfides, which are predominantly underground, but the laterites are all up on the surface. They're very shallow. They're very spread out across the surface. And in Indonesia, they're all in tropical rainforest. So you have to strip away that forest to access the ore. And the regions where the nickel is located, it's a region ecologically, it's known as Wallacea. It's named after Alfred Russel Wallace, who's the famous naturalist who basically inspired Charles Darwin on his theory of evolution. So he traveled through that area, and really the amazing, unique species that he identified was what brought about his theory of evolution, which he then passed to Darwin. But there really is a remarkable amount of biodiversity in Sulawesi and Halmahera, where the nickel mines are located, there's sort of also really cute, high-profile species as well, which could really attract the attention of NGOs. So I think this issue is really brewing under the surface, and I think at some point in the next 5 years, this will really become a huge issue, which operators around the world will have to handle, especially in Indonesia. But it's not just the terrestrial biodiversity either. The nickel mines are typically coastal because that's the most accessible ore at the moment. And so the runoff from those mines, if it's not managed, it runs straight into the ocean. And if you stand on the beach around these mines, quite often you'll look out and the ocean is just completely turned red because of the red mud that's coming off the mines. And this smothers a lot of the coral that's in the area. And again, the coral in this area, it's known as the coral triangle because of the amazing marine biodiversity. So again, that's another issue which could trigger sort of this sort of NGO spotlight on the Indonesian nickel. And what can be done? It's definitely not all mines that do this. There are a number of really good mines in Indonesia who are able to manage the biodiversity risk and the marine risk really well. So the methods of mining sustainably in Indonesia are well known, they're well documented, it's been done for decades, but it's a matter of sort of bringing those practices across the industry now, and that's the real challenge that we face.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the child labor issue in the Congo. It only takes one or two bad operators to taint everybody and cause a big problem. More than a decade ago, I was involved in Sheriff's work on the Ambatavi project in Madagascar. And you want to talk about, cute species that people care about, the lemurs are it. And, it was a lot of work to establish a good biodiversity program there, but we did. But it took a lot of planning and a lot of effort. It doesn't come free, and it doesn't come without effort and thinking about it. And, the thing about the tropics that gets me is because the area is so productive, so biologically productive, there isn't a lot of organic value in the soil. It's all in the trees and the life that's there, unlike northern Canada. And so once you remove them, you've kind of removed all that nutrient value. But because it's so productive, you get a lot of endemism there. And I've seen that in other locations. And I think you must see that in Indonesia too, Steve, where, there's species that only exist here and nowhere else. Is that a big issue?
Absolutely. So, where Vale operates in Sorako, they have their hydropower that you've mentioned. But that hydropower is fueled from 3 lakes, which exist right on the doorstep of the mine. And those lakes, each lake has endemic species which only live in that lake. They don't even live across the different 3. So there's an enormous amount of endemism. And so Sorako, where the mine is, has visitors from Canada and from all over the world coming through on a regular basis to study those lakes because they're so unique from both a water chemistry, but also from a biodiversity point of view. And so that's just one story, but it's similar across the different areas. Each valley can really have some very unique species in it.
And each island.
And Lyle, what about impact on air quality? Is that an issue as well?
So, the air pollution doesn't get a lot of airplay right now in the nickel space, although it should. Coal-fired power plants and smelters are 2 of the 3 biggest sources of sulfur dioxide pollution on the planet, along with the oil and gas industry, large, as a grouping. The highest ranking emitter globally is a nickel smelter in Russia. 2 million tons a year of sulfur dioxide going out directly into the atmosphere, 5 times more than the next highest smelter of any type, which is a copper smelter. But people don't care as much because it's mostly a local pollution issue. And, northern Russia, there isn't a lot of people around to look at it, unlike carbon, which is, a global issue. But, Indonesia's smelters, they treat oxide ore, not sulfide ore, so they don't have the same issues with sulfur emissions from the smelters. But that coal-fired power is an issue. Any source of coal is going to contain sulfur and nitrogen. It's going to make sulfur dioxide and NOx, and these are bad for people and bad for the environment locally. They just don't tend to travel globally. Interestingly, the second highest ranked nickel smelter in the world for sulfur emissions is in Vale's Sorako smelter in Indonesia. They use a unique process there where they add sulfur to the oxide ore in order to make the product that they want to make. So they've got low emissions from their power source, but then they've got these high sulfur dioxide emissions in the middle of the island, and that's a problem. It can be captured. It's just a matter of economics. So nickel sulfide smelters in Canada and Europe have either spent billions of dollars to add sulfur capture to them. Inco, now Vale in Sudbury, famously built the biggest stack in the world to send its sulfur over to Europe back in the 60s, but they eventually put in sulfur capture. The Thompson smelter closed 3 years ago. That's the last unabated nickel smelter in Canada. It's now shut down. And that's the story in the Western world, is we shut these facilities or we make them invest. For sulfide smelters that are geographically isolated, there aren't a lot of good options, right? You can make acid out of the sulfur and ship it. That's pretty costly. You can use lime or limestone to desulfurize the gases like we do on power plants, also pretty costly, or you can shut down. For coal-fired power plants, scrubbing for particulates is a good answer for some of the pollution issues, but it doesn't touch the sulfur and nitrogen. Sulfur scrubbers, flue gas desulfurization is a known standard technology. I doubt it's running on most of those new coal-fired power plants, but it could be retrofitted. It's very standard tech used here in North America. You use a limestone slurry, you scrub the SO2 out of the flue gas, and that takes all the other pollutants with it. The problem is you need regulations to drive it. Nobody's going to invest that money without something really pushing them to do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Within Vale, Vale a few years ago was driven by regulations in North America to invest in sulfur capture in Sudbury. At the same time, in Indonesia, they elected not to. And so, you know, it was very much regulatory driven, these decisions. So there's no sulfur capture done at the Soroko plant at Vale's plant in Indonesia, even though the emissions are higher than what they are in Sudbury. So yeah, you're right. It really requires attention from the regulator to drive that sort of behaviour. Yeah, the other ESG issue I thought I'd mention, other than air pollution, is just the water. You know, the main emissions from the current, or the main pollution source from the current Indonesian production is air emissions. It's the stacks. But going forward, as we look to develop HPAL plants, water is going to become a major issue, I think. So with a HPAL plant for the battery sector, the main you know, it's done by leaching out the nickel rather than smelting it off. And so when you leach it out, there's a waste product which is wet, and that releases a wastewater into the sea usually. And so you know, those HPAL plants in Indonesia, we're going to see you know, potential water issues, I think, emerge. And one of the key things to keep in mind with the laterites is that where there's nickel in laterite, you almost always have chromium, which coexists with the nickel. Now, this chromium is typically safe, but under certain conditions, it can oxidize to a dangerous form of chromium, which is called hexavalent chromium. So that's the pollutant which was the cause of the problems in the movie Erin Brockovich. So I think all the lawyers in the room has probably watched the movie Erin Brockovich, but that, you know, she fought against a company which was polluting, and the pollutant involved was hexavalent chromium. And if you've seen the movie, you know that it causes all sorts of deformities, and it's a very, very toxic pollutant. Now, that hexavalent chromium is generated in a large portion of mines in Indonesia. Not all, but I would say probably half of the pits in Indonesia would produce hexavalent chromium in the wastewater. So it's treatable, but it's you know, it's an additional installation that's required to treat that. And so it's really, with the scale of the mines that are emerging in Indonesia, really could be a massive human health issue if it's not properly managed. So that's something just to keep in mind going forward.
You're right, Steve. And what about, I mean, if we're talking about ESG, there's G as well. What about corruption in the Indonesian mining sector? Is that an issue, and how can it be resolved?
Yeah, I think it is an issue. So Indonesia's typically ranked fairly poorly in sort of the corruption indexes around the world. So, you know, you know, I'm not aware of corruption issues within the nickel sector specifically, but I think it's important for nickel operators to invest in a proper anti-corruption, anti-bribery and anti-corruption program. And I think that's going to be something that customers will demand, that nickel is sourced from operators who have these systems in place. So I've been involved in implementing such systems in Indonesia, and they are, they're very challenging and time-consuming to put in place. You can do a simple one quickly, but a robust and effective anti-bribery and corruption program takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of work to get in place and do it in a way where you don't cause problems with regulators. So a lot of these, I'm not, the what's the way of saying it? There's a lot of small issues which are sort of common practice in Indonesia, which are not which may not be flat out bribes per se, but they can be perceived in that way. So for example, if you have a remote mine site, quite often the only way in is on the company chartered flight. Now, taking an official on a company chartered flight can be perceived as a bribe. And so to develop systems where the government is willing to pay for that flight onto the site, it requires a lot of time, a lot of effort to work with the regulators who are just used to having that. The government's just not set up to pay for those sort of things, frankly. And so it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and there's a lot of, you can easily cause offense by bringing these systems in. So it really is very challenging to put these systems in place, and it takes a lot of time, and that's something that really I think all operators in Indonesia need to start working on immediately.
Right. So, okay, we're getting maybe a fairly grim picture here. I mean, it looks like the industry is affected not just by carbon footprint issues, but really a number of ESG issues. And I guess the way to resolve those, I mean, across the board, it sounds like, well, we can have greater consumer monitoring of what's going on and voting with their feet in terms of how they go about buying products. A lot of it can be driven by law and regulation. All of those will require transparency and some way of knowing what's going on right all the way down the supply chain to the ore in the ground. And a lot of dealing with these issues, it looks like it's going to, as always, involve cost as much as anything else. Hopefully, I think the market through COP26 and the gradual move or concerns about climate change in particular mean that the market is showing that it wants these issues fixed, and implicitly that means that they're willing to pay what it takes to get those issues fixed. But I guess that means that the people supplying the nickel need to understand that there should be a price point that covers the cost of dealing with these issues, but they need to be confident that that's going to come to fruition and it's going to affect everyone equally. With so many issues for the industry to deal with, can I ask each of you to maybe have a bit of a think about the outlook for the industry? What does the future hold, and are there reasons to be positive? Lyle, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely reasons to be positive. I was involved with the Ambatavi project in Madagascar, far more corrupt nation than Indonesia by all the rankings. And you can run a business there successfully. You can do it with respect for the biodiversity, with respect for, yes, we have a coal-fired power plant there. Sure, it doesn't own it anymore. But you can do things right. But it's harder. It's harder in a country where the norm is not to do those things. And that's where that transparency really is going to come into play. And blockchain technologies and stuff that are being pioneered on cobalt are going to come to nickel and are going to bring that transparency, which is going to force operators to do better. And it isn't so much that the consumer is going to have to pay for it, I think, Andrew. Stephen explained very well that all the construction has been going on in Indonesia because it's the cheapest place to build them. Yes, it's the cheapest place to build them, but why is that? If you start layering on these costs, what you then see is a more competitive environment globally where they may not be quite as profitable in Indonesia, and you'll get some development in other countries as well, and you'll be able to achieve a better balance of impacts for the products that we need for the world.
Yeah, I think so. I think, when you look at the Indonesian production, though, I still think even with ESG improvements, it'll still become the cheapest place to produce nickel, and it'll be the fastest place to develop. I still believe that Indonesia will be the bulk of that, even if they switch to fully renewable power, for example. And we're seeing that sort of happen. So at the moment, I think the existing facilities are looking to offset their carbon footprint by putting in solar panels, large ones, of course, but that won't take away, that will reduce the carbon footprint, but it wouldn't bring them down to the level of like an Australian or a North American producer. But over time, what I think will come in the next, say, 10 years is that the production facilities in Indonesia will start to be developed in other locations where they have better access to fully renewable power. So there are sites in, say, Kalimantan or in other parts of Indonesia where there's geothermal and hydropower, which is more readily available. And those projects will take some time to develop, not the nickel projects, but the hydro and the geothermal projects. They'll take the time to come online. But once they're online, I expect there to be another sort of rush of investment on Indonesia to build additional nickel facilities, and they will have a much lower carbon footprint than the ones that we see today. And so I think that's really the future for Indonesia, is to move their nickel production over to renewables. And then on the mining side, the biodiversity issues, I think with proper supply chain due diligence, the mines can improve and be properly rehabilitated. And it is amazing what you can do today with satellite imagery and blockchain to be able to track and see whether that nickel has come from a mine which is doing its rehabilitation. So that's coming really very quickly to Indonesia, and it will force a lot of change. And yes, the price of ore will go up because of that rehabilitation that's going to improve. Yes, the price will go up because of the renewables in the short term, because of the cost of developing renewable power. But I think over the long term, it's still a very cost competitive jurisdiction to develop nickel.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, I think I certainly, and I'm sure everyone on this webinar, hope that you're right, and that there will be ways to make big improvements, and certainly the industry in Indonesia will need to be aware of the need to get ahead of the curve on dealing with these issues if they're going to stay competitive. We're actually a little bit over time already, so we don't have much time for questions, but there was one question that touches on some of what you just said, Stephen, but you were referring to this earlier, Lyle, as well. The question was from Paul Chirinos, who was asking why it is that the economics for Indonesian nickel are the best. Maybe, Lyle, you can speak briefly to that, like by comparison to other parts of the world. Then I'll pose a question to you, Stephen. We better wrap up soon.
Yeah, so the issue really, most of the projects that have been built in Indonesia to date are these alloy projects for stainless steel, and they're cheap and fast to build. The Chinese have figured out how to fund those and build those in a hurry, and time is money. Bringing a new project on in North America or Europe with the regulatory hurdles and everything else, you're talking about 10 years and something in the range of $100 million just to get through the regulatory red tape. Probably more if you're in the US than in Canada. Minnesota is a basket case. They've got 3 good nickel projects that probably won't get built. So that regulatory burden is huge, but the deposits that we have, hard rock deposits, lower grade, the best stuff's been mined, right? Sudbury got mined 100 years ago. Thompson opened up 60, 70 years ago. We're going into the lower grade deposits now, and those just cost more. And we weren't developing a lot of the better deposits in Indonesia 60 or 80 or 100 years ago. So they've still got some really good deposits there that don't exist elsewhere. New Caledonia has been in production for a long time, but all the best stuff's gone. And grades are much lower now than they used to be. So they're simply not as competitive as Indonesia. That labor cost advantage is huge. Technical skills in Indonesia are good. I started up the Gresik copper smelter there back in '99, and it was clear then that technical skills were not a hurdle, right? And they've had 20 some years to get better since then. The issue really becomes one of, going forward of regulation and stakeholder pressure, making sure that the right things get done. But, it's cookie cutter plants that they're building there now, right? And there's a cost advantage to doing that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In Canada, you have to go deeper and deeper underground. It's hugely costly. Whereas in Indonesia, you bring in an excavator, a dozer, a few simple trucks, and you can just push the soil away from the top and access the ore. It's 20 meters under the surface in soft soil. So it's incredibly cheap to access the ore. And then, as you say, it's the cookie cutter sort of engineering out of China for the smelters, using cheap power. They build their own power plant using coal from Indonesia. The whole system is really very cheap. And that then is allowing the future HPAL projects, which are more costly, but they're able to piggyback off that infrastructure and the mining infrastructure as well. So the HPAL projects will take limonite, which is already in the truck because they're already mining it to access saprolite for the existing smelters. So it's an incredibly cheap operation compared to other places.
Yeah, I think you'll see some development in the Philippines as well, which, they've built, Sumitomo's built 2 high pressure acid leach plants there using the same philosophy. Take the limonite that's being stripped and set aside to mine saprolite for shipment, and then process that because it's already mined. So I think you're going to see more developments there as well. But the tropics are the place that we're going to be looking for a lot of this nickel. We just need to get better at not destroying the place while we do it, because that would be a real shame.
Yeah, thanks. And Lyle, I just got another question in from Craig C, asking about the opportunity for nickel recycling. This is something that's going to be required under the EU battery regulations. Can you just talk? I mean, we're really running out of time, but just for a minute,
Yeah.
What's the viability of recycling nickel? Can we reuse the stuff that's coming out of old batteries?
Oh, absolutely. It's, the technology is not terribly difficult. It's going to happen. The problem is going to be the timing of it. I know companies that are working on this today. The problem is that you don't have enough critical mass of batteries to make a recycling plant technically, economically viable today. It's like recycling stainless steel. It takes time for it to come back into the recycling chain. So, if you think about batteries going into a car for 10 or 12 years, and then they may, there's a lot of work going on now to redeploy those batteries into second uses for grid storage. That nickel might not come back for 20 years. And, the growth pattern for the nickel market is over the next 20 years. So recycling isn't going to save us, but it will eventually reach some kind of a steady state where you get 80–90% of that nickel back from the batteries afterwards and can remanufacture it. And there's a Northvolt in Europe just produced a battery pack with all recycled materials to prove that it's exactly the same as a fresh battery, right? Which we all knew it would be, but they've just proved it.
Well, we're all hoping for the circular economy to become a reality. I've got a curly question for you, Steve. Given the way things are today, given the way the nickel industry in Indonesia is today, do you think it would be hypocritical of Tesla to buy Indonesian nickel for batteries in Tesla vehicles?
I think it would be hypocritical if they just bought from anybody, but if they were selective in who they purchased from, I think that's fine. There are a number of really well-sustained, well operated facilities which meet all the sustainability criteria and world class. So I think being selective now, they could do that. But I think over time, the Indonesians, the other operators in Indonesia will also improve. So I think we'll get to the point eventually where they can source any nickel from Indonesia.
Well, I think that's a wonderful positive note to finish on. I think we're a bit over time, but look, thank you everyone who's tuned in. I think we had up over 50 during the call, and most are still on. Sorry that we've gone a little bit over time. On behalf of Lyle Trytten and Stephen Brown, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today to our webinar on the Nickel Pickle. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly find it an interesting topic. There'll be other energy and resources law events coming up, so please look out for those. I will mention that the Energy and Resources Law Association is launching a branch in ASEAN based in Singapore next year. So if you'd like to know more about that, please get in touch with the event organisers. I would also say that if anyone would like to get in touch with Steve or Lyle after the event, we're going to send around contact details to everyone who registered, so that in case you've got any follow-up questions, we'd love to answer those, and I would as well. So Steve, Lyle, thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks for everyone who tuned in.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks all.
Pleasure. Bye.